Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, back with another Market Watch episode. So as I'm sure you guys can tell from the thumbnail, this is going to be a pretty interesting Market Watch. We're talking about some interesting, really old cards that I think most people wouldn't really think that we would see in competitive play. But to be fair, that is part of the fun of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it makes me really glad that we don't have rotation the same way that Pokemon and Magic do. It just means like some old obscure cards from like 15 years ago can be relevant or good all of a sudden. Anyways guys, let's jump right into it. Alright, to kick things off, we're going to take a look at a couple of strange cards first, starting with Earth-Shattering Event. Now this is a Floodgate continuous spell card with a pretty simple effect. If a card or cards are sent from deck to the graveyard, you can target a card in either player's graveyard and shuffle it back to the deck. Then neither player can send cards from their deck to the graveyard for the rest of the turn. So of course this card is being hyped up as a side deck option to use against the Ishizu cards, as it really does kind of just outright prevent milling. However, do keep in mind that this is a mandatory effect, so it's going to be activating as Chain Link 1 behind the effects of Tier Limits and everything else, so your opponent is still going to be able to have those cards resolve and get other things onto the board. If they don't have an answer though, then this card could potentially be turn ending and really annoying for Tier Limit players to have to deal with. Obviously, a lot of players are afraid of Ishizu Tier Limit since the deck was basically Tier 0 in the OCG, and people think that it might be here as well. There are a lot of people scrambling to find whatever side deck options they can to see what works to counter the deck, and Earth-Shattering Event is a card that only has one secret rare printing from the side set World Superstars, which came out back in 2015. Super cool tech card. Personally, I don't really think it's going to be seeing that much play. I think it's a bit overhyped and isn't as great as people are initially thinking it will be. The card is currently around $10 on TCG Player right now, but since I don't think it's going to be seeing much success, I think it's overpriced. It might require more testing, but I personally wouldn't be looking to pick this card up right now. Rather, I would dig this card up out of your bulk because it used to be only like 50 cents or $1 and offload them while the card is seeing some major hype. Next up, we have probably the strangest card in this video. It's Mushroom Man number 2. So this is a warrior monster with a simple effect where the controller takes 300 damage during each of their standby phases, but also during the end phase of each turn, you can pay 500 life points to give this card to your opponent. So a really old, weird card. Apparently, this is a tech that is being used by some Kashtira players. The idea is that you're using number 89 to lock up multiple of your opponent's main monster zones, and then you use that last zone and you give them Mushroom Man number 2 to lock up that last zone, and now they basically can't do anything. This is very similar to how people are using Nightmare Corruptor Ibli in sprites, but with Ibli, people have been teching in Lingaribo in the extra deck in order to break the lock, but there's nothing you can really turn Mushroom Man number 2 into. Also very conveniently, this card is a warrior, which means that it can be searched with reinforcements of the army as well. So yeah, this is a card I never thought that I would need to talk about as a part of any meta deck, but it's definitely interesting. However, this card only has one printing from back in Metal Raiders, the second set to ever come out in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! So it's probably going to be really difficult to find a copy of the card that isn't damaged. Because of this, a near mint copy is actually going to cost you $6 a piece, which not the worst thing in the world, but it's a lot for a copy of Mushroom Man number 2. Definitely dig this card up out of your bulk if you are an older player or might have it lying around. And if you're planning on playing in just a couple of months, you better hope that no one ever attacks you for game with this card. Next up, let's quickly take a look at Silent Graveyard, formerly known as Forbidden Graveyard. This errated card has a really straightforward effect. You can discard a card from your hand to negate any effects that activate in the graveyard this turn. The really great thing about this card is that it is a quick play spell card, and because of the way it's worded, you can chain it to an Ishizu Mill 5 where they have multiple effects that are activating in sequence, and this would negate all of the effects that your opponent chose to activate from the graveyard in that chain. I personally think that the card is really awesome. I guess the only real downside here is that it only lasts for one turn, right? So you really have to try and hope that you can set up enough to blow your opponent out of the water as soon as possible. It does also require a discard, but there are so many cards in the game that want to be in the graveyard that might not really matter at all. Silent Graveyard has always been a fairly cheap card. It has 2 common printings that are still under $1 each. Its one holo printing was actually an ultra rare from Dual Devastator, which is currently about $2 a piece right now. It seems like a lot still though, because I remember this card being like 25 cents and I just get copies of this card passed to me with people's bulk, and it was like a guaranteed pull in Dual Devastator, right? So there are quite a few copies of this card on the market from people that were opening that set just to get like their Ash Blossoms and other hand traps. I do actually think that this is a card that's worth picking up, especially as we're about to enter a format where Ishizu Tearlament feels like it's going to be pretty close to a tier 0 strategy. This card may not have much more room to go up in price, but it's a card that you're going to want to have access to when you're playing over the next few months. So speaking of negating cards that are activating in your opponent's graveyard, Vanity's Call is a really cool counter trap that I think might have some potential as a Tearlament counter. This is a card that can only be activated as Chainlink 4 or higher by paying half of your life points, but when you do, you get to negate the effects of all other cards activated before this card in the same chain. Now this means that if they have milled 11 cards with Scream, Merly, and Kit Kalos, and they try to activate multiple Tearlament effects and Ishizu card effects, those are all going to be negated if you have a Vanity's Call. As a counter trap, this card is really hard to stop, and in fact, Red Reboot isn't even an option anymore because it's banned. The downside here is that it's a counter trap specifically being used for this purpose, so your opponent could still pop it with like a Perlerino or a Feather Duster on their turn. It is a bit vulnerable, but personally, I think it's just a pretty interesting side deck tech choice, and I think it would be the funniest thing to see this card resolve and negate like 5 or 6 of your opponent's cards all at once. This is yet another card that has just one old printing. In this case, Vanity's Call came out as a common back in Cyberdark Impact, which came out in 2006. And I think that Cyberdark Impact is a set that everyone at the time said was just like a horrible set. So I don't even know if there's going to be that many copies of this card floating around on the market. Right now, a copy of this card is going to cost you right around $5. Honestly, if you can sell this card, you're probably better off just like dumping it rather than trying to hold it. But I stand by my earlier statement. If you can, try siding this against some Ishizu Tearlament players and you are bound to make someone extremely salty. Alright, so there are a few other cards that I think are still important for us to cover, even if they aren't as gimmicky or hilarious as some of the other cards we've talked about already. First one to pay attention to is Drag Down Into the Grave, specifically the super rare version from Legendary Collection Yugi's World. This card lets each player look at the other player's hands. You each select a card for the other player to discard, and then you each draw a card as well. So I think with this one, people are talking about using it with the Dark World cards. Since we are getting the Dark World structure deck fairly soon, it would allow you to trigger Dark World effects from your own hand, but more importantly, gain knowledge about what your opponent has in their hand, so you can try to rip out a key piece or maybe like a hand trap. So right now, even with the new support, Dark Worlds aren't doing too well over in the OCG. But we have the TCG here, and the TCG and OCG are obviously really different, and maybe there's a chance that the deck will do better here than it has over there. Fortunately, Drag Down does have a few different common printings from structure decks and whatnot. Those should all be fairly cheap at under $1. However, the card has just the one holo printing as a super rare from Yugi's World, and those are going to cost you around $7 to $8 right now. I do think that the super first heads though might be a decent chunk higher at around $13 to $15 each. This is just a price bump for you guys to be aware of for now. If you have some lying around, you might want to consider selling it now, or you might want to set them aside for when the Dark World structure deck is officially released here in the TCG and people try to bling out their decks and are willing to pay a little bit more of a premium. Next, I think we need to talk quickly about Kashtira Unicorn. So this is obviously a card for the Kashtira strategy, which isn't doing very well in the TCG at the moment. The deck probably isn't going to be doing anything for the next couple of months here. However, in Photon Hypernova, the next core set that we should be getting at the beginning of 2023, there is another wave of Kashtira support coming, and that support actually makes the Kashtira deck really scary, to the point where it's a top tier strategy in the OCG and is able to compete with what's left of Ishizu Tearlaments. It's a cool card that can search for a Kashtira spell or trap from your deck, as well as potentially banish a card from your opponent's extra deck face down. Now, on the release of Darkwing Blast, Kashtira Unicorn was only like a $6 to $7 card, as people thought, meh, it's just another like average ultra rare. However, with Photon Hypernova now being legal in the OCG for competitive play, and the Kashtira deck seeing competitive success with the new support, people kind of realized that they should maybe be picking up some copies of Unicorn. almost overnight the card jumped up significantly to where it now sits at $16 for a single copy on TCG Player, almost triple what the price was before. This is most definitely a card to keep an eye on over the next several months, especially if we get a ban list to tier limits that might set the stage a little bit easier for Kashtira. Expect this card's price to cool off a little bit as people slowly forget about the card and more copies become available on the market. If you can get copies of this for around $10, that's probably a very safe price point to snap some up at so that you can resell them in just a few months. And finally guys, the last card here that I'm trying out in my Labyrinth deck, Temple of the Kings. This is a card that has received an errata. Originally, when you activate it and it's on the field, it would let you activate trap cards during the turn they're set. Now, however, you can do that, but just with like one trap card per turn. So it doesn't facilitate any super ridiculous FDKs, OTKs, anything like that. For me, I think Temple of the Kings is a really cool way to let Welcome Labyrinth be live right off the bat, and to trigger the effect of Lady Labyrinth even sooner, as well as activate the trap that you set off of it during your opponent's turn, which is kind of busted. Now, I'm not saying that Labyrinth is going to be top tier or anything like that, but I think it's a really cool deck with a lot of potential that I'm having a lot of fun trying out. Because of the errata, Temple of the Kings does have a couple of cheaper printings, including like a really ugly gold rare, and the card is fairly cheap overall. However, the card's original printing for the TCG was back in the Merrick structure deck, which wasn't super popular or made widely available. Actually, I think the card was like banned when it was first released, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, the Ultras are about $3 right now. Nothing too crazy, but with the other printings that are actually dirt cheap, I think there are a couple of common versions. This is definitely worth noting if you happen to have opened those decks way back then, since Necro Valley and Lava Golem are actually pretty notable cards that were in that structure deck as well. Sometimes you end up finding a lot of hidden value from the more obscure cards and products that just go overlooked for a really long time. So if you think that you might have opened this deck up way back a few years ago, make sure that you check it out because you probably have a few cards that are worth a couple of bucks. Alright everyone, that is it for today's episode. Kind of a random one with a lot of really obscure cards today, but that's what keeps the market super fun and interesting. I do have a regionals this Saturday that I'm definitely like underprepared for, but hopefully Labyrinth can get me there with Ishizu tier limit debuting. If you guys are in the Vancouver, British Columbia area, maybe from like Seattle or Kelowna, Vancouver Island, make sure that you guys say hi. I'd love to see you guys. That is if you are not going to be in Pasadena. If you are in Pasadena, good luck with the YCS. Anyways, guys, if you did enjoy today's Market Watch episode, please make sure that you let me know by slamming that thumbs up button for me. Also, make sure you leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you guys think about the cards we talked about today and what other cards are trending on the market so I can potentially cover them in a future episode as well. Also, if you haven't already, make sure that you hit that subscribe button to get all of the latest and greatest content from both Tombox and myself. And until next time, guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.